Hi everyone, I'm Heath Hightower, co-host of Process Recordings. Before we get started with today's show, I want to just give you a quick reminder. While Lisa and I hope you find our show useful, we also want you to know that it's not a substitute for therapy. If you do need a therapist, however, we do recommend that you check out the psychologytoday.com website. Also, if you need immediate support, contact 988, which is the 3-digit number to contact the National Crisis Hotline and Suicide number. Thanks for listening and watching, and enjoy the show. Hi everyone, I'm Heath Hightower.
And I'm Lisa Wessan.
And this is Process Recordings, the show where we have real conversations about real human experiences, and we offer tools, tips, and techniques to address some of life's greatest challenges. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Heath. Good to see you.
It's really nice to see you, too.
Yes, and I'm excited about our topic today, discussing boundaries.
Boundaries, and more boundaries.
Barrera in Spanish. Yes, it's a very powerful topic.
Yeah.
It's foundational, really. The more I thought about it, the more I realized, as therapists, a lot of what we do is help them. I first identify boundaries. What is a boundary? How do you set a boundary? How do you maintain a boundary? But yeah, let's begin. And
so speaking of what a boundary is, do you want to tell us what a boundary is?
I have some ideas.
Yeah.
So basically, there are many different kinds of boundaries. There are psychological boundaries, and there's physical boundaries, there's psychic boundaries, and these are invisible limits that help us define who we are and what we want and what we're not willing to tolerate in terms of conditions. And people don't read our mind and know these. They have to be spoken or somehow asserted, whether in writing or in words, right? And we protect our sense of self and our autonomy by setting boundaries.
Yeah, so I think about boundaries as the multitude of limits that shape the relationships we have with ourselves, other people, and the world. Mm-hmm. And I like the word limits because it makes me think of city limits, which kind of demarcates where a city begins and ends, right? And I think about that also in the context of human beings, that boundaries really in many ways differentiate kind of what we need and what we want from what other people may need and want and what the world may need and want. So I think that word limits is a really important word.
I like that. It's nicer than maybe not nicer, but it's more gentle than my interpretation of boundaries. As I shared with you the other day in our pre-show discussion, is 10,000 ways to say no.
Yeah.
No. You cannot do this. No, I don't want to go to that restaurant. Yeah. No, don't touch me like that. No, I don't want to go here.
Sure.
No, that's inappropriate what you said. You can't talk to me this way. When we say no, we're setting a boundary.
Yeah.
And it's something that I really believe needs to be taught, and everyone struggles. Some people are really good at it. As a horrible stereotype, women are often really serious people pleasers as a group. There are men who are people pleasers too, but women taught to be the nurturers, the givers, the mothers, and are giving to the point of exhaustion and burnout, and learning to say no, learning to say yes when we mean yes and no when we mean no, and let the chips fall where they may, and become bulletproof to other people's disapproval and anger. And to borrow from Mel Robbins' new book, let them be annoyed. I say no, I'm not doing that. Let them be frustrated. Let them have a tantrum. Let them. I'll become bulletproof. That's the goal, to become bulletproof to people's disapproval. Learning to be comfortable being uncomfortable when I set a boundary for my well-being, knowing that it's the right thing. Simple, but not easy,
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why it's not simple or easy in many instances is that our boundaries are shaped by lots of different factors and forces, right? So when I think about the clients that I work with, and even my own boundaries as a human being, to a large extent, our boundaries are shaped by history. They're shaped by the historical context that we're born into, right? And so in different historical time periods, people were expected to have different kinds of boundaries. People were expected to say yes or no in different circumstances. For example, women didn't have a lot of autonomy for much of human history. So the idea that they could even have a boundary would have been completely out of the norm,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I think about culture. The cultures that we are embedded in also shape our boundaries. They shape how we think about saying yes and saying no. I think about our families that we're born into or that we are raised by, very much the norms around what is expected in terms of saying yes and saying no. I also think about power and power dynamics also shape our boundaries. So, for example, the boundaries that I have with my husband are going to look very different than the boundaries that I have with my boss, right? Like, it's much easier in some instances to say no to my husband than it is to my boss, because the consequences of saying no to my boss are just different.
Yes, very good point.
And then finally, I think the other force that really shapes boundaries is just our own temperament, right? Different people are biologically set at a different temperature, if you will, for things like closeness and proximity. Some of us like people in our space. Some of us don't like touch. Some of us are more sensitive to noise. And so those are another force, our temperament, that kind of shapes.
That's a very good point. Yeah, there are precursors. And learning the idea of setting a boundary was really new to me. I didn't really bump into this until I was in my early 20s. It was, or in college maybe, somewhere when I was young. Because in my house, growing up, there was sort of dictatorship. And God bless my parents, did the best they could. Mom and Dad, if you're listening to this, I don't have a shred of resentment against you. But a lot of times it was like my way or the highway. Get in the car, we're going here, or eat that, or do this. There wasn't a negotiation process. It was like, this is the right way, and the children didn't have a voice, and that was how they were brought up. And I understand they just conveyed their own parenting. They reparented us how they were taught it. That generation was less negotiable, and like now, kids are definitely able to negotiate more and to ask for things, to say, I don't like this, or I don't want to go there, I hate this school, and the parents will listen and say, So anyway, and we have to learn. Someone's going to teach us this eventually. Learning how to ask what we want without fear of being shamed or punished. I know when I was younger, if I asked for certain things, I'd be punished, and I learned to not ask.
Yeah. And so why do you think it's hard for people to set boundaries? What are some reasons why it's been hard for you or the clients that you see?
Right. Well, I think there's 1,000 reasons, but they come down to fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood or punished, fear of something bad happening, fear of losing the relationship, all kinds of fears. And also the fear of shame, like maybe I shouldn't be asking for this. There's am I being inappropriate? Yeah. It depends on the age. So again, like younger people have their issues, and then those of us who are like older, we have other issues, but there's fear, some kind of fear.
Yeah. I think sometimes, as you said earlier, because we don't talk about boundaries, sometimes people are oblivious to whether they have them or not, right? Like I think sometimes there's an ignorance is bliss quality as well. People just don't know that boundaries are a thing. I think fear can certainly play into that. But I also just think that some people just don't know that they have boundaries because no one ever talks about boundaries.
Well, and I like to talk about the tactical and practical, which we'll get more into in the second part of this program, part 2, the how do you set boundaries? But it's a little bit comes in here also. Like on a very basic level, whenever I call someone, I always the top of the call, I say, is this a good time? Can you talk now? And I learned this a long time in work and business, a long time ago, but before I was a therapist. And because you give them permission, that's setting a boundary right there, giving them permission to opt out. When someone calls me and they go right into launching into a whole big conversation, and I'm like, I'm in the middle. I picked up the phone to say, hey, I can't talk right now. Maybe I'll speak later. So I thought I'd be able to arrange something with them, Mm-hmm. So that's a boundary that's very practical to say, I can't talk right now. Mm-hmm. I can't talk right now. I'm sorry. When can we speak? Mm-hmm. Simple, not offensive, and hugely relaxing, Mm-hmm. And that's something that I wish some people in my life would do when they call me, but they don't. Mm-hmm. And I've asked several times. I always book it. I like to book ahead of time if I can with certain people. But anyway, that's a boundary that many of you may be not realizing is being breached. And you're picking up the phone feeling annoyed. Well, first of all, you don't have to pick up the phone. You can let the phone just take a message. But, that's a boundary. Mm-hmm. And also weighing and measuring time on the phone. I mean, there are certain people in my life that if I allow it, they'll keep me on the phone for 45 minutes, an hour, going on and on. And I maybe because I'm older now, I don't have the stamina or the energy for that anymore. And they're typically complaining about things. Mm. And so now I'll say at the top of the call, this is a boundary. I'll say, I have 15 minutes right now. Is that good enough? Can you do 15 minutes? Because I have to get off in 15 minutes. I have something coming up. And that's a nice little boundary. And that the person gets refocused and oriented and go, oh, yeah, I can do 15 minutes. And then I say, okay. And then we go through the phone call and we get off, for me, effectively versus 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And those little boundaries are really helpful in day to day,
Yeah. And I think one of the important things that you are noting is that boundaries are always relational, regardless of what the boundaries are, right? So I think one of the important words in the definition that I offered up was that it's limits that shape our relationships with ourselves, other people, and the world. And so that relationship piece is really important because it means that there is the act of establishing boundaries, but there is also the act of making sure that those boundaries are being enforced, right? So it's one thing to give people the rules, the expectations of what we want, but then there is also the enforcement piece, which is what happens when people break the various kinds of boundaries that we have. So I do think it's worth emphasizing the relational piece to this, whether that's first and foremost being aware of your own boundaries with yourself in terms of your relationship with yourself, and then that kind of builds out towards your relationships with other people and then the broader world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it's so important what you're saying. In fact, in the Dialectical Behavior Therapy Manual, the DBT group literature, there's this wonderful section where we talk about the Dear Man skills, which has to do with setting, asking for what you want, and also but maintaining self-esteem, maintaining the relationship. Not distancing or pushing someone away, going nuclear during the process. Learning how to respectfully ask for what you want in such a tone and such a way that you're more likely to get it, and also being politely persistent, being a broken record even. And so some people just feel like Also, I talk about voice modulation. I mean, there's a whole process before you set a boundary. I always say get in touch. If it's someone you love, get in touch with the love you feel for them first, and then speak, because your voice is going to sound like silk and velvet when you're making the boundary, setting the request, asking for a request and making a boundary, versus just jumping right in and speaking, and then it can come out harsher, and the voice sounds like crushed glass and sandpaper in the person who's receiving. So the voice modulation while setting a boundary is a very important thing. And most people don't, pause and take a moment to adjust their voice, because then you set a good the boundary is much more likely to stick.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's also important to really name just the myriad and multitude of voice boundaries that actually exist.
Go
right?
for it.
Well, no. So I mean, I think some of the examples.
We have like 20 pages of notes.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think that some of the examples that you give are incredibly powerful and important in terms of giving an example of when people cross a boundary, what you wish they would do differently. That's super important information. And I think it's also really useful to just know that there isn't just one boundary that we have.
No.
The boundaries are physical, they are emotional, they are mental, they are spiritual, they're even digital. I mean,
Financial too.
Yep,
Borrowing
financial.
money, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that really just being aware that for all of those different kinds of boundaries, so a physical boundary really has to do with your body in relationship to other people's bodies, the spatial relationships.
Proximity. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Emotional boundaries are really about what do you share emotionally? Like what emotions do you share with whom?
Yes.
And in what context do you do
what's
that?
What's oversharing? What's too much information? The TMI factor.
Right.
Some people, I had to learn that a little bit too. Being a New Yorker, New Yorkers tend to spill like too quickly.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate in Boston area.
Yeah. And then things like our mental boundaries are things like, who do we share our opinions with? Who do we share our belief systems with?
Huge boundary. That's huge.
What belief systems do we allow ourselves to be exposed to versus belief systems that we really distance ourselves from?
Absolutely.
Time boundaries, like how much time do we allow people to spend with us? How much time do we spend with people? How long do we spend doing a particular task versus some other task?
Right.
And then I think the newest boundary that people are really having to negotiate are digital boundaries, right? Because in a lot of ways with the use of technology, there is no beginning and end for like when work starts, right? Like we literally can kind of be accessible to people all the time with our phones and our various devices.
Yes.
So I think thinking about like just how much technology are we consuming, how much technology are we allowing to kind of be at the center of our daily existence.
I know. I love what you just said. And just to break that down a bit, unpack it a bit, is that, for instance, in my office policy, it says that texting is only to be used for time-sensitive, administrative, or calendar issues. Do not write anything personal here. It's not encrypted. Now, maybe it is encrypted, but it doesn't matter. It's like not encrypted enough, probably. It can be hacked. So they know not to text me long paragraphs. I know there are some therapists who do text therapy. Good for them. It's not me. I'm not into that. Anyway, they respect that. I only get a text if there's a calendar, or insurance question or something. And I love that. And also the boundary of being in digital land, I'm not all that much on I have Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn accounts, but I'm not on there all the time. But I will not share personal opinions about certain things like publicly.
Oh, sure.
Because who's going to see that? And it's too complicated, and I'll write out a blog post or an essay somewhere and I'll bury it, But anyway, that's the boundary too. Like I can't share my personal stuff online because, clients might see it, patients might see it.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate. So,
Yeah.
but the texting and the digital, and also setting the boundary. I had a friend years ago in New York, when cell phones were relatively new, probably. But during lunch, she kept looking at her phone, and I said to her, "Stop doing that. I'm here with you. We only have an hour and a half, and I feel annoyed." And she goes, "Oh, but it's so important. I've got to check." And she did it once, and then she did it again. And it really affected our friendship. And I said, I don't want to go out with you anymore if you're going to sit there on your phone while I'm sitting there. And I had this was like in the 90s. It was like a long time ago, but it was very stressful to me. And now I know it's still an issue. People still have problems with the phones. But I know when I go to lunch, I put it, unless I'm expecting a doctor phone call, I put it on airplane mode. That's it. I'm not going to look at it. Just out of respect. That's a boundary. That's a boundary, saying I don't do cell phones unless we're both going to check a movie time or something together, So, you know what I'm saying? Because that's a boundary that's very, that's a termite on my serenity, people checking their phones while we're eating.
Sure.
I don't like it.
Yeah.
So, boundaries on micro level and macro level.
Yes,
And of course,
absolutely.
and the macro level, international politics, war, whatever. Then we get into Ukraine, all that. That's a big boundary thing too. Sure. We're not going to get into that. We're staying on the micro level today.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. But as social workers, we're aware that the macro affects the micro.
Yes, it does.
And so, in the context of our work with clients, we're certainly having conversations about their macro experiences and how that's trickling down to
Especially
affect
now.
them at the micro level.
Yeah.
No, I think that is all really important. All really important.
I know. The good news is that there is a solution. You can, if you don't know what boundaries are, if you're listening to this, you're listening or you're watching this for the first time, you're scratching your head, not to worry. Because I remember the first time I heard this idea of boundaries, I was befuddled. I didn't know what the person was talking about. That learning how to set a boundary, and then I became more and more intrigued. How to get better, how to do it, how to get good at it, and how to function. In the second part of the show coming up, we're going to talk about how to set boundaries.
Yeah, and I think a way to operationalize boundaries is it's each individual person's rule book about what they say yes and no to at the end of the day. And that to me makes it a little bit more concrete in terms of what a boundary is. It's really about, what are the things that are acceptable and not acceptable when you're interacting with me, when you're in relationship with me, whether it's a physical and sexual or romantic relationship, whether it's in some sort of digital interaction, whether it is we're having a conversation about religion, like no matter what the topic is, no matter what the boundary is, it invariably comes down to what are my yeses and what are my nos.
Right.
And that ultimately is what the boundary is.
Yes, and in our last 5 minutes, I want to say that a big leap to do this work is giving yourself permission to be vulnerable. Now, Brené Brown, who's one of my virtual mentors, she says vulnerability is your superpower. And what that means is allowing yourself to be uncomfortable and be a little open and say, this is important to me. I need this. I want this. I'd like to have this, whatever it is. It's scary to put your needs out there. And being vulnerable, though, gives you permission to ask for what you want. And so if you don't get it, well, at least you asked, and you're not going to be crushed from it. You're going to just, you ask. All you can do is ask. If the person says, no, I'm not willing, all right, deal with it. But the vulnerability makes you stronger and also can bring the people closer together. Like when someone puts himself out there and say, I want this and I want that instead of this and that, you get closer as a couple or as friends,
Yeah, so I think we've done
it's a big risk. My point is learning to be comfortable being uncomfortable is part of this process of making boundaries because it's very uncomfortable sometimes to ask and say no.
Yeah, and I also think that it's important to understand what the discomfort is about because I do think that there are forms of discomfort that people should pay really close attention to, right? So, and again, I think the discomfort may be protective in nature. It may be something that's helping you stay safe. So when I think about boundary work that I do in my professional life, a lot of it is around people who have been traumatized in some way, either physically and or sexually traumatized. And so the important thing in that work is always about helping people understand why their boundaries may be as tight as they might be, and then wondering with them, what would it be like if those boundaries were looser? Like, if it's a problem in particular. So I think it's important, at least from my perspective, that if the discomfort that you're feeling is getting in the way of your well-being and happiness, then it's worth looking at and maybe looking at ways of changing them. But if you're actually kind of content with your really, really strict, firm boundaries, then it's probably not a problem.
Yeah, it only becomes a problem when someone's complaining or putting up, making you notice something. And but I agree with you that sometimes certain things happen that trigger us, and we get very upset. And you don't know why. And sometimes a boundary has been violated. And it's there's an expression in therapy land: if you're hysterical, it's historical. And the idea that if something's happened just now that doesn't seem like a big deal, but why am I so upset? it's a violation of some sort. Then you go face it and trace. You go, oh, it's that when I was a kid, this happened to me with my uncle, whatever. Like, and then you remember that's why it's so upsetting in 2025.
Right.
So when our boundaries are violated, that also brings up a lot of information, and that needs to be processed. And it's not good to reach for a cupcake or weed or booze or go shopping. You got to face those feelings and process them out. So when boundaries are violated, that's like, well, that's what we do in therapy land, helping people process those uncomfortable feelings. But it's also good to have awareness that it's normal and that you're okay. And even when you go nuclear inappropriately, well, you got to trace that back. Well, where's that coming from? And it's often a boundary violation.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I think part of the work and part of the hope around boundary work is that you can understand your boundaries, and there are things that you can do to edit those boundaries, to shift your expectations around those boundaries. And, we'll be talking more about that in the next episode.
The juicy how-to. How-to. We give you a break now.
Yeah.
Yes.
So as we're entering into our last minute of this episode, I'm wondering if you have some closing thoughts or words of wisdom as it relates to boundaries.
From my personal experience, I'm going to borrow from Shonda Rhimes, who says, if I don't say it, I eat it. So for me, if I don't speak my truth and be authentic, I'm more likely to have a food problem. And I would like to stay my healthy weight. So that's, if I don't say it, I eat it. We'll talk about that more. But that's a big thing, to speak up the words so you don't stuff them down with something.
Yeah, and I think that for me, the closing thought that I would just want people to be aware of is start thinking about boundaries. Start thinking about what you say yes to, what you say no to. Think about the ways that yes and no serve you, as well as the ways in which saying yes or no may be keeping you from the life that you want to be living.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this first episode of Boundaries. I'm Lisa Wessan.
And I'm Heath Hightower.
Yes, and we love to discuss things that help us grow, learn, and serve on a higher level of consciousness. Good health is wealth. Go for it. And we'll see you next time.
Take care, everybody.
Process Recordings is produced by Lisa Wessan and Heath Hightower, with technical support from Chelmsford TeleMedia, the community media center of Chelmsford, Massachusetts.